And a very good evening, everybody, and welcome to a Lyceum evening coming to you from the Paul Christian Spiritualist Church down in sunny Poole. Used to be sunny. It was sunny before the last 40 days and nights of rain, seriously. Down on the south coast of the UK. Great delight to welcome Minister Chris Connelly to our evening this evening.
Good
Chris,
evening.
may I call you just Chris? Or
Yeah, please do.
thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Chris, very big warm welcome to you. Thank you so much for giving your Saturday night up to be with us here online. Something that always engages people, because you go, how did that happen? How did you become medium then? How did you know? So if you just give us a little bit of background, please, on your mediumship route to where you are today.
Fine, I can do that. So the mediumship route goes back to around 96, and I ended up due to circumstances of friends and so forth of attending Gravesend Spiritualist Church up in North Kent, where I live. And I went along to support friends who had lost relatives, and they got a communication. And I was fascinated by how that communication happened, because it gave them a lot of comfort, getting this communication from their loved ones. And so I went up to the medium afterwards, along with the family I was with, who wanted to thank the medium for the evidence that they'd been given, and that this medium started giving me information about loved ones that I've got in the spirit world. Well, that was enough to get my curiosity going, as they say, and I went back to the Grace and Spirits Church twice a week for about 6 months. And what was interesting was that every week, as you know, there's a different medium every week. But every week, I was given a communication from loved ones in spirit, all saying that, you know, if I wanted to, I could do this as well. Or so this, whatever this was, you know, at the time, you know. And so, you know, but you know, I turned up at the church. I was in my early 20s. You know, I just thought this was some sort of cult recruitment campaign going on. You know, you got young guy there. And you know, let's just say things to him and hope we can sort of like reel him in and be part of this cult, as I saw it then. But as I said, it went on every week for 6 months. Every week for 6 months, got a communication from the spirit world saying, no, you can do this as well if you wanted to. And after about 6 months, the president stood up and said that they'd been getting complaints. There were some members of the congregation that were complaining that there were certain individuals that seemed to be getting messages every week, and some of the congregation never seemed to get a message at all. Well, I instantly, you don't have to be Einstein to realize that they were probably talking about myself. And what was interesting was at that moment, I thought, well, look, you know, if there is a spirit world or whatever, I sent a thought out and said, look, I hear what you're saying. Okay, I've understood. You know, I don't need another message to tell me this. You know, just go to somebody else or do something else this evening. And from that moment forward, I mean, obviously I'll get the occasional one, but from that moment forward, never got a message from platform at Gravesend Spiritualist Church. However, a week later, I was invited by the church to sitting there, what was an open circle, and that was it. And but you know, I've always been a scientist. I've always had a background in that, and science engineer involved in technology in many ways. And so I used to turn up to the circles half an hour early, so I could set the chairs out, so I could make sure there was no trickery involved, make sure there was no tape recorders, light machines, or any other sort of fraudulent trickery. So whatever happened in that circle on that evening, I knew it was just, if you like, bums on seats, if you like. Yeah. And I did that. And within the third week, I was invited to stand up to give a communication. Like most people, you stand there and you think, I haven't got a thing. But then the medium sort of like encourages you to say, look, just do what you just close your eyes, and that's what the process. And surprisingly, someone in the circle accepted the information was going, and that was it. From that moment on, I decided to put aside, if you like, the skeptical, analytical sort of mindset, and think to myself, look, I really want to find out more about this mediumship stuff, this spiritualism stuff. So I think I'm just going to sort of like just throw myself in at the deep end and just say, let myself experience this process, experience what this spiritualism is. And that's what I did for about 10 years. And about 10 years ago, I started to switch on that science again, the scientific mindset, and explore a lot of the experiences and a lot of what we understand within spiritualism from a rational scientific basis. But as I said, I still work as a platform medium, a working medium, and it's been an interesting journey trying to balance, what I know about the spirit world, what I experience from the spirit world, with this sort of analytical, scientific sort of knowledge of inquiry and skepticism, if you like. Right. So that's pretty much me in a nutshell.
Oh, that's right. Well, thank you all for joining us tonight. That was a lovely night. Thank you, Chris. And no, seriously, I absolutely love that about the people complaining. Because I've seen it in many churches. You have this sort of home guard. And why do the new ones always get the message? Because they're new. And because the spirit world are welcoming them in. It's just like, okay, anyway.
Exactly.
Love that. I haven't heard or thought about that energy for a long time. It just tickled me. So thank you very much, Chris.
You're welcome.
Because you talk here and you've introduced very nicely, thank you, about your scientific side. Now, I've been having a little route around the internet. You are a doctor of philosophy, master of science.
Well, let's just clarify. I'm a PhD student at the moment, so I'm studying for a doctorate in philosophy.
Right.
Don't quite have it just yet.
Just say it. Just
in arm's reach. That's the one.
Let's put it this way: you're a lot closer to it than I am. But yeah, you've got to actually. I found the website because I'm made aware that you are the science ambassador for the ISF, which is the International Spiritualist Federation. And I have not until today looked at their website, but I must say I was mightily impressed. I do like the language that is being spoken on there. It's nice, simple expressions, which I love. I absolutely love.
Absolutely.
You hold the title there as the Science Ambassador.
That's right. It's something I'm quite. I feel honoured and privileged to hold because it's a role that's been around since the 1920s, 1930s, and there's been subsequent sort of like science ambassadors since that time that have held that role, and it's a responsibility where we try to collate information about what the scientific literature says about mediumship, says about spiritualism, says about healing, about all faculties of mediumship, all spiritualist phenomena, and we try to make it publicly available to spiritualists. So the ISF has a website, which you probably went on to, but there is also a .co.uk version of that website that holds information about, it's got a blog on there that I add on every once in a while when interesting papers come out that support, or not necessarily always support, but maybe, argue some aspect of spiritualism in some way, of mediumship. And so we try and propagate that, but also act as a bit of an interface between spiritualists and the academic community, because that's kind of important as well, because we want to make sure that as spiritualists that if we are to partake in research, that we understand that the findings of that research could flip either way, but what's important, and what I often stress to mediums is that, contrary to popular belief, science can't prove you not a medium. You know, a scientist or a researcher can never say to someone, no, you're not a medium. You know, it's not possible. They don't have the authority or the power to do so, but also they don't have the scientific evidence to suggest that. You know, all they can say from a single study that they do is that that we didn't find anything. Well, that's fine. You know, either, you know, it could be, and there's multiple reasons why that might happen. You know, for example, the study may not have been adequately designed or sensitive enough to pick up the subtleties of mediumship in some respects. You know, so there's all sorts of things for that. It could be the medium, you know, was below par, and that's the thing about a lot of the studies with mediums is that mediums are people. Surprise, surprise, mediums are people, and with that introduce a whole host of complexities in ensuring that you're getting the best out of the medium, out of the participants, you know. So that's what I do as an ISF ambassador, just try and bring the two. We talk about as a medium, bring the two worlds together, but as a science ambassador, I bring the two worlds of spiritualism and academia together, and just work as an interface if I can, but also bring this literature base to spiritualists so they know more so than not, to know that what they're doing isn't. There is an underpinning of science and common sense and rationality upon which spiritualism is based.
Brilliant. Sorry, I was just searching for a link there to post up for somebody, because a few of the people will be aware who are watching tonight. I was recently involved with another study that's ongoing at the moment through King's College, and including my own learning. When we engage with these scientific studies, it's not to go, oh, look, yes, we can see it. That's it. It's conclusive proof. It's to gather evidence, you know, which is going over. I mean, the study I'm involved in has been going on for 3 years actively and 3 years prior to that in the setting up.
Yeah.
And you're not going to get this conclusive piece of evidence at the end of the day, but you're just going to get all the facts presented to make up your own mind.
Absolutely. And this is it. You know, one of the things that I've often come across, because there's been a lot of mediums in the past that have taken part in research, and they will say, you know, well, we've done the research. You know, why do we need to keep on doing more research? And what we fail to understand is that, like the study you were part of at King's College, you know, they would have a hypothesis that they're looking to explore, you know, but from that, other researchers will come in to try and elaborate further on that study. Do you know what I mean? And so science is about looking at small, answering specific questions, which then can be proven, or not say proven, but results shown to be possible that or not possible, or you know, we say, you know, we accept or reject the null hypothesis is the term we use, but we can actually by getting that work out there and done, you know, it allows space for other scientists and other researchers to build upon what's done. And it's these small incremental steps that builds the greater body of knowledge on all sides of science, you know, all fields of science, and that's how it works. So, for example, you know, I'm doing my doctorate now, looking at the cognitive processes mediums use when they communicate with the spirit world. And the reason for doing that is that there's some evidence previous of some research that was done showing that, you know, that in ESP studies, in extrasensory perception studies, like telepathy and clairvoyance and things like that, that the participants seem to score higher if they have a good ability of being able to stay focused. Well, okay, but there are other factors. And so taking that one little bit, what I'm doing now is that we're thinking, okay, that's the case. Does that also apply for mediumship? And if it does apply for mediumship, what other cognitive strategies or other cognitive functions are also maybe implicated or associated within the process of mediumship? And if there are others, do those others make us stand out as mediums from the general public as certain functions? Do you know what I mean? Are we using do we have a better performance of being able to stay focused, for example, than Joe Bloggs down the road? Because we're using our mediumship more often. And if that's the case, so these are these little questions, So if that's the case, what if then we trained the mediums, not just in mediumship, but also to be able to remain focused? You know what I mean? Giving like brain training exercises or meditation exercises or something. Will that then improve their mediumship? Do you know what I mean? So we're trying to look at how, this is what my doctorate is about, is looking to see these cognitive strategies that are used to see how we can enhance mediumship, not do away with the conventional circles or conventional unfoldment, because we still need to develop their relationship with the spirit world. But I personally feel that, the processes that we use as mediums in our unfoldment haven't really changed since the 1800s, and it's like, well, we're in the 21st century now, Obviously, we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater with the techniques that we use, but let's look at these techniques and see how we can possibly improve them or introduce new techniques to at least meet the spirit world in halfway, shall we say, in our unfoldment. And so this is what my doctorate is about, my PhD is about, and hopefully we're finding some interesting information from it.
Wonderful. So this is like this giant jigsaw, and
Absolutely.
each piece of the puzzle is made up of other jigsaws to be put together.
Absolutely, and that is science, and that's the science. That's the scientific method. That's what science is all about. Is building, is looking at the literature, looking to see what other people have done, and saying, oh, okay, but you've not done this, and you then build upon that with a new idea, and you do your research. So hopefully, I'm in the process at the moment of one of the studies I've done, going through and getting it published in a peer-reviewed journal. Now, the hope is that some other scientists, some other researchers somewhere in the world will pick up on that, will read that and think, well, that's kind of interesting, but Chris didn't do this. He missed this bit out. Let's do an experiment and see what happens when we do this and this and this, based upon what Chris has done. And then you get this picture building up, gradually going, getting bigger and bigger, and you get this bigger body of knowledge, as we were saying, and then we start to understand more about this mediumistic process that we use, and hopefully, take the things that our pioneers of spiritualism have discovered and done, but actually add to it, add some science to it, or add some new methods to it as well.
Definitely. I love that description you got there, Chris. It's a fascinating subject. We've got a comment just come in here from Arish.
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry, coming this one. This is a perfect one. In 2019, I was invited to do a presentation at the conference of the Society for Psychical Research, and I was presenting some studies, some neurological studies, some EEG studies, looking at the brain and what it shows in mediumship. And as a sideline to that, there were two things I pleaded with the researchers out there who attended this conference. One was, please stop treating mediums as if we're just one big homogenous group. We're unique individuals. I'll give you an example what I mean. Someone might do a study looking at, for example, you're part of this study at King's College, looking at, and they did some MRI scans of your brain, and looking at for something. And they did that for a number of mediums. But the question rises, is there differences between someone who's predominantly clairvoyant, clairaudient, clairsentient, clair-knowing, or claircognizant? Is there differences in that? that has different functions, because they may be looking for similarities, but they may have a whole variety of mediums using different faculties of their mediumship. They might not see similarities. They may see complete variability. Do you know what I mean? So one of the things I pleaded with scientists and researchers was, don't treat it as a homogenous group, okay? Because we all work differently in many ways. And in my study I'm doing now, I asked participants to rate from a scale of 1 to 10 the different faculties of mediumship they may have in terms of how strong they believe their faculty is, because it's a variability. The other thing is, exactly that. Science does not acknowledge the third person in the experiment. They don't acknowledge spirit. And I often say to them, if you have to at least entertain the idea that the spirit world are part of that experiment, and they have to be part of it. Now, of course, there is potential that the spirit world may not wish to participate, in which case one would hope that the medium is sufficiently developed to, and honest, to say to the researchers, sorry, I'm not getting anything today, rather than maybe working it a bit too much, shall we say, and struggling with it and giving us like a below par sort of performance, if I could use the word performance. So yeah, absolutely, the spirit world have to be acknowledged in this, and this is one of the things I was stressing at this conference in 2019, because and actually I mentioned it in one of the literature things, that one of the papers I've acknowledged as well, that one of the findings that from this is that as mediums we treat the spirit world as very much as distinct objects or distinct people. We don't treat them as figments of our imagination. When we're working with the spirit world, they're there, just as there as anyone in the congregation may be there. So it's important that the scientific community acknowledges this, and also acknowledges the limitations of their study if the spirit world don't want to participate.
Yeah, absolutely. Really interesting. And actually, something I hadn't shared, when I was taking part in the study up in King's, it was to work with the mediumship, was just the directive. Well, I'm used to working with my mediumship up there with a load of people in front of me, not lying flat there with head pinned down in a very confined space. So the first 10-minute session, I was getting communication, but I was just like, I don't know what to do with this, because I'm getting it and I don't know what to do with it. So the second session, I worked with my philosophy guides. The third session, I thought, I'm not getting any validation here. And so my mind keeps popping into this. So I'm going to go to where I am really, really comfortable. And I went for a psychic walk. And they found that fascinating, because I said, well, by the third time, because I'm trained to yes, no, maybe. Yes. And not getting that. And also, it is not comfortable at all in those machines. It seriously isn't. I thought, no, my mind's coming into this. So therefore, I use it on the last bit on the psychic side. And they were actually very happy that I was that honest and that I'd worked different faculties. Absolutely. And that's a very interesting point you raised there, is about the training we give our mediums. One of the things that I was pushing for a little when I was a member of the Spiritual National Union was trying to, because the ASNU does training and give awards and accreditations and things like that for their mediums, as do the ISM and other organisations. But that training is based on standing on platform. Like you said, you're standing on platform in a church environment or in a centre environment in some respect. Being in a lab environment is very different, in many cases. And it's really that what I wanted to do was to encourage the SNU to try and include an element of training in lab
situations. Being in that situation when you're in a room on your own with maybe just a video camera staring at you and like a one-way mirror or two-way mirror, so to speak, in front of you, and someone saying to you, like they said to you, go on then, off you go, do your stuff. It's a very completely different environment, and of course we don't always take the environment into account when we're doing the studies. And again, that's something we need to look into. Can we make the studies more, so we say, ecologically friendly? Which we mean by that is, can we make them more like the sort of environment that the medium is more used to working? Because if we take them out of their environment, then actually the performance or the mediumship may not be the same in some way.
Right.
So yeah, absolutely. And I think we spoke to scientists over in America from what's called the Wimbridge Institute, and we spoke to them because they developed a screening process for people with mediums that they then used once they passed the screening process in their research. And what was interesting was that every study that they've published using these mediums that they screened to show that they did have some mediumistic ability, every study that they've published has shown significant results demonstrating that there is that these mediums were getting information from some way. And in fact, what I'll do, if that's okay, I'm going to share one slide with you, just give you an example of that. Let's just go up to this. So here is a study that was done. This was done by the Wimbridge Institute, and it was this study that they've titled, "Anomalous Information Reception by Research Mediums Under Blinded Conditions." So the first thing that strikes me here is that you've got these blinded conditions, that basically meaning that in this particular case, the mediums didn't know who they were doing a private sitting for. So that the sitter was in a different room and the medium was in another room, and there was no communication between them at all. And their conclusion was, as it says there, because the experimental conditions of this study eliminated normal sensory sources of information mediums for the information mediums report, a non-local source, and I like the bit they put, however controversial, remains the most likely explanation for the accuracy and the specificity of the statements that were made by the mediums. So here they're saying quite clearly that, we don't know. We screened these mediums from all the normal sources of where they could get this information from, but their accuracy was still such that it was still significant. And what we mean by that there is that the recipients understood the communication, understood the evidence that was presented to them, and this is, we see this quite a lot with a lot of the studies here, because here's another one here, that was done, and this was a meta-analysis that was published last year, 2021. And this was a meta-analysis, and the meta-analysis is basically where a researcher looks at all the literature out there and says, when we look at all the literature, what is on balance, what does it actually say? Here, they looked at all the research studies that were conducted between 2020 and 2019, if memory serves me correctly, so like a 20-year period. And in this study here, they concluded, the results of this meta-analysis support the hypothesis that some mediums can retrieve information from deceased persons through unknown means. So again, they're saying that, we test these mediums and they're getting this information, but we don't know where they're getting it from because, we're screening them from everything else, So when, we hear very often skeptics say, we're doing cold reading techniques, or you're making it up, or hot reading techniques. Are they terms you're familiar with, Lawrence? Yes. Cold reading and hot reading? Yeah. Well, just very briefly for those who may not, cold reading is a technique which skeptics say a lot of mediums and psychics use, are basically when we use generalities, general statements. You've got a bad back, you've got a grandfather in spirit, your grandmother knitted, all these types of things, all these sort of general statements. Hot reading techniques are accusations that somehow, I want to make me laugh, somehow the mediums research the sitters before they do the demonstration. So, so a medium coming to church somehow seems to know who is going to be attending the church and has somehow researched all the sitters, and so are able to present information to them in that way. This is the general two arguments, or the two explanations that the skeptics will give. And so what we have here are researchers who are eliminating that by the medium not knowing who the sitters are, and in some cases in the blind or in triple blind studies, not only do the mediums not know who the sitters are, I mean the sitters don't know who the mediums are, and that the individual, the researcher's assistant who actually introduces or because as you said, Lawrence, there have been someone that would have greeted you at the door, brought you in to the room and all the stuff. Yeah. Well, they don't know who you are and who the sitter is. Do you know what I mean? So you've got all these people who know nothing about anybody coming together, and even in those circumstances, you find cases like this where the mediums are clearly demonstrating that they're able to get information about deceased people. But again, science at the time is still erring on the side of caution because they're saying from unknown means. However, later on, there's another paper. Okay, now this is quite an interesting one. As I said again, this was done with a triple blind protocol, as I was explaining earlier, where basically nobody knows anybody in the experiment. And this one clearly states that this study provides further evidence that some mediums are able to obtain accurate information about deceased people, knowing only the deceased name, and with no interaction with the sitters. It also supports the hypothesis that in some cases, sources of the information are the deceased themselves. So here we have a paper that's published in the peer-reviewed journal that's actually saying, look, we've accounted for every other possible source of information and we've eliminated it. So the only other possible source of information these individuals could be getting this information from are the deceased themselves. And this is quite a, I emailed the lead researcher here and said to them, there's quite a bold statement to make for a peer-reviewed journal. What was your thinking process behind that? And he just basically said, as I mentioned, that, that we've eliminated everything else. So the only other possible hypothesis, the only other possible source is what was the spirit world. And so, you've got these type of papers that are coming out now, clearly showing that, if you have the right, the right mediums or the right medium, we are able to demonstrate quite clearly in laboratory conditions and with the control conditions that we would accept, drug companies to use, exactly the same protocols, exactly the same sort of level of scrutiny, and we're seeing researchers saying that the source of the information, the deceased themselves. I mean, this is absolutely incredible.
We need to turn our attention to the comments box because that has been filling up rather rapidly.
Go for it. Let me see if I can maximize this.
A comment here, lovely Jack from Denmark. Jack and Lola are over there watching us. Going back to a previous part of the conversation, you're saying honesty is important with the science part as well as the daily practice of mediumship. Yeah. Absolutely
true. But also you need the honesty the other way back as well. We need honesty with the researchers and science with us. And another thing that I've often spoken to researchers about is including spiritualists or including mediums in the design of their experiments. Not so that we can ensure we show something positive or beneficial, but because as spiritualists, we know more about mediums or mediumship than the academic community. We know how it works for us. We can explain it, very well. So, I think there's honestly both ways with this.
Because it's got to be quite something, hasn't it, to design a study that is not in anybody's favour. It is not designed to trip you up, and it is not designed to make it easy for you. It's just got to be that.
I mean, what you're doing is you've asked yourself, you're trying to find conclusion to a question that you're asking. Does this happen? But it's whether you find something or not, both are equally valid, because if you don't find anything, then you know not to pursue down that road. Do you know what I mean? Or if you don't find anything valid, you can ask yourself questions like, well, was my study sensitive enough to find something? Do you know what I mean? There's all sorts of things, and this is why I said, and that's why I said at the start, science can't ever disprove mediumship. They can't. You can never say to someone you're not a medium. And this is why I think we should all, if you're keen to, try and participate as much as possible and get involved with science as much as possible, researchers, because we have an opportunity not only to be pioneers in bringing the communication with loved ones through, but also pioneers in educating researchers as well.
Ooh, now that's interesting that you just put that in there, because that ties in very nicely.
I must be psychic.
You must be psychic, or you can
read.
Be. The lovely Mark Stone.
Yeah.
He's saying, I know it's a contentious area, but many physical mediums of the past seem to be open to scientific testing. I know that there are scientists and researchers now open to examining this area, but are there many mediums actually coming to work with them? You don't have to name names, but what's happening in the physical mediumship scientific exploration that you are aware of?
Okay. First of all, what I'll say to that question is what we have to understand as well, we don't want science to become like an orthodox religion. Okay, so what I mean by that is that science is equal, scientists are equally flawed as anybody else. So when they do studies and they come to conclusions, what I've often found is, and I say this because there's a particular physical medium who was shown to be, shall we say, behaving suspiciously on camera back in 2016. Something was shown, recorded, showing that this physical medium wasn't demonstrating physical phenomena, that has subsequently feels that they've been vindicated because of a particular study that was done, a scientific study that was done to demonstrate that this person was authenticated. Okay, and so and because of that, there's a lot of emphasis on that study to say, well, this person is now genuine. Okay, bit cryptic, but I think most people understand who I'm talking about and what I'm talking about. What I would say is one study doesn't prove anything. Okay, doesn't prove anything at all. It just demonstrates that at a particular moment in a particular time, this happened. So I'm not aware of any. The thing is, scientists don't really. I've spoken to researchers about physical phenomena, and scientists in particular, and they're not all that keen, because the reason for that is because they know that they can't necessarily control the environment, because physical mediumship, we know, or we're led to believe from the physical mediums themselves, that it has to be done in a certain way for this phenomena to occur. And what that means is it opens them up to it prevents the scientists from being able to put the controls in place that they would like to do. Like I was showing you earlier in those papers that have been published, The scientists there were able to control the environment, able to control where sensory information could be leaked, where information, alternative sources of information could come in, fraudulent information could come in. But of course, in a physical format, in a physical science, that's not quite possible, unless you have a physical medium who's willing to work closely with scientists and develop a sort of protocol or a sort of environment which is more conducive. Maybe fully lighted environments, rather than in darkness or under red light situations and so forth. So I'm not aware of, apart from this one medium who was, there's actually a couple of mediums who have both been shown, shall we say, to have suspicious, or let's put it this way, have their behaviour led to some suspicions about their authenticity. And they both have had studies done by the same scientist, interestingly, by the same researcher, same scientist, who seems to vindicate their suspicions, or sorry, who seem to disprove the suspicions and say they're genuine, if that makes sense. But that being said, there have been other scientists who have come in, have waded in with their size 12s and said, well, I've found criticisms with the study that was conducted that have used these mediums. So it's a big field. It's a big sort of complex field. There's, as I said, we can't. Out of all of this, what I would say to that question is, please do not ever accept one study as being evidence of someone's genuine ability. Let's put it that way.
Very well put, thank you. And it totters into one of my pet peeves, is when people cherry pick certain items, and especially, I've been a Christian spiritualist church, we've had a few instances where somebody has taken a line out of context from the Bible, quoted it with this huge authority and entitlement, and then just stood there and wondered why it hasn't had the effect they wanted. It's just like, get a grip. Anyway, moving on.
Okay, moving on.
Sue Townsend, Chris, how much does science take into account the subtle energy field which may not be seen with the physical eye? This being where the connectedness to spirit may reside, i.e. in the etheric links, because spirit may make themselves known unexpectedly to people unaware of spirit previously.
Okay, let's break that question down into a few bits. Okay, so there are a number of words in there, or should we say assumptions in there, that we could possibly challenge from a scientific perspective, because one would say, that this being the connectedness to spirit may reside, i.e. in the etheric fields. Well, that's what we think is happening. As spiritualists, that's what we've been taught, and so that's what we say is happening. But actually, there's very little literature, very little science or evidence to suggest that is what's happening. So this is an area where I was saying to you, Lawrence, earlier, where what I'd like to do is try and look at what we understand as spiritualists, because that hasn't changed since the 1800s. We talk about the etheric fields and things like that. That was all parts of the the things that were discussed in the 1840s, 1848, the birth of modern spiritualism, and so forth. And nothing's changed. But the question is, is that what happens, or is there something else that happens? Or is there something more deep and meaningful that happens? So in terms of the subtle energy field, there are obviously studies out there that look at the subtle energy fields relating to healing in particular. And so that's an aspect there. I mean, you've got the Kirlian photography, but again, it's still quite a controversial topic in that respect. And so, yeah, I mean, there are a little few studies, but it's very sparse in that respect, because one of the things we have to try and work out is, well, how do you test for this subtle energy field? If the energy field is so subtle, what do we use to measure it with? How do we know it's there? How can we take something that's subtle and make it objectively viewable to and measurable in some way? So there are a lot of aspects in that question that you have to sort of like ask, well, okay, how do we do this? Is that an assumption? Is that something we know is true? Is there literature that says that, or is it just something that we've accepted because it sort of explains the mechanisms that in a way that we can understand, you know?
Brilliant, thank you. Jamie, lovely Jamie Williamson. Chris, why do you think it is that there is a shortage of qualitative studies into mediumship? Phenomenological,
yes. It's all about IPAs, interpretive phenomenal, yeah, absolutely IPA stuff. What I would say is that there's a shortage at the moment. The reason for that, I think, I would suggest, looking at the literature, reading the literature, is that in the past we've been the researchers have been concentrating on the evidential aspects of mediumship, in the sense that, you know, I just put up on the screen there, you know, are mediums really doing this? Is basically the question they're asking, you know, and they look at what's called quantitative studies that are measured, you know, in numbers, you know, in terms of the accuracy of studies and so forth. But what I've found over the last 10 years, that if you look at the literature, there seems to be a shift. It's a gradual shift, it's a slight shift, but it's a gradual shift where researchers are moving away now from looking at the evidence, what we call evidence focused, and looking at what we call process focused. And what we mean by that is that we now want to understand, well, how do mediums do this? Because there seems to be such a wide evidence pool now, body of knowledge, that seems to suggest that mediums are doing what they're saying they're doing, in the sense that they are getting information from somewhere. And as I showed earlier, you know, there are now papers out there that say this, they're doing something, and we believe they're getting it from the spirit world, you know. So now the emphasis, and this is where I think the qualitative studies into mediumship will come in, because now what they're looking at is looking at the experience from the medium's perspective, and looking to see, well, how are mediums doing this? This is what we mean by process focus. We're looking at the process of mediumship now, to understand a bit more about what's going on. And that, I think, is kind of exciting, because that then allows us possibly to draw upon that knowledge and inform our practice as mediums or as tutors in terms of helping other exponents unfold their mediumship, because hopefully we'll find things in this process that can be beneficial in terms of our own sort of unfoldment and unfoldment of others. So I think it's because, Jamie, I think it's because you know, it was a shift. In the past, it was just very much more, you know, we want to prove or just want to see whether mediums are doing what they claim to be doing. And now they're looking at, as I said, now they're looking at how they're doing it. So I think you'll see the qualitative studies improve. Also, very briefly, not a lot of researchers like qualitative studies. I've seemed to have hinted at, or I've come across as well. There's a lot of researchers prefer to crunch numbers than to do qualitative studies, and so that might be something to do with it as well.
Brilliant, thank you. It's just really interesting hearing you talk there. I just can see sometimes where this conflict comes in between spiritualism and the scientific community, because, you know, I can hear people answering from their emotional bodies.
Absolutely. And this is why I wanted to, you know, not come to the fore, but get involved more with science from that background, because, you know, and again, you know, why I said, you know, in my introduction about myself, why I decided to throw that sort of skeptical, rational, analytical thinking aside, because I wanted to gain that experience. Because I knew this, I had to experience being a medium. I mean, I never imagined in my wildest dreams I'd be working on platform and I'll be a minister. You know, I mean, that was just so far removed from my thinking at the time. But by having that experience, having that, being able to understand that phenomena, if you like, personally as an experience. And adds a lot of value, I think, with the research that I'm doing now, because I'm looking at this research and I'm looking at it from a mediumistic perspective, or at least looking at it from having a background as a medium, thinking, okay, I could do this, but I kind of don't think that's going to work for some reason, So I could do that, but I might have to do this, or I might have to appreciate, or I might have to acknowledge that some mediums might not be happy with that because of X, Y, Z. Do you know what I mean? So it's being part of the community, if you like, as added value, I think, to the research that I'm conducting.
Yeah. Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. Observation here from, hang on, there's a reprobate in the room. Please remember, everybody, wonderful you putting your comments in there, but we may not catch up with them until about 5 minutes after the topic is gone. So please never feel like you're being ignored. It's by the time we come to your comment, you're thinking, what's that about then? But anyway, Carl, lovely to see you in the room tonight. Welcome, welcome. Lovely Jack again. And I know this referred back to something you were talking earlier on. And he's just saying that he's got fantastic evidence from his grandfather that nobody knew of. The evidence came from mediums from around the world. Evidence has been confirmed years later when family members investigated the family tree.
Very similar to something called the correspondence studies. If you go to the SBR website, the SBR, the Society for Psychical Research, they've got what they call an encyclopedia, like a Wikipedia. Although it's not Wikipedia, they called it something else. I can't remember what they called it. They call it the Psi Encyclopedia. Out of interest, a lot of the SBR members try to use Wikipedia to talk about mediumship, survival, or NDEs and this sort of thing. But unfortunately, the guerrilla skeptics on Wikipedia would log in and change their entries, and so the SBR decided to set up their own Wikipedia sort of thing that would actually talk about mediumship and survival research. So I don't know if you know, but the SBR have been around since the 1880s, and they were formed in London in the 1882, I think it was. They were formed in London by a load of lead scientists at the time to explore the claims of spiritualists in particular, and they've got a whole database going back to 1882 of research that was conducted by that's the one. Thank you, Mark. And a whole bunch of research from 1882 that demonstrates all sorts of things about mediums and spiritualists. You've got the original research conducted by into Leonora Piper, Florence Cook, and all these sorts of names that we hear about. You'll read about them and the researchers that did those studies on this website. And but there's a one called the correspondence studies in particular that were very, very similar to what Jack was saying, where evidence came from mediums around the world at different points in time, and it was only when the information came together it all made sense.
Yeah,
so very famous case.
Yeah, absolutely. Going back to Mark here, he's just picking up from his earlier comment. And I think what we're saying here is there any spiritualist associations investigating physical phenomena more?
Not investigating. No, not that I'm aware of.
No.
Okay, not that I'm aware of.
Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful.
But of course, if Mark knows anything, I'll be interesting. If he's hinting at something here, I'd be interesting to hear from him.
I shall see him on Monday. I shall get the tongs out.
Yeah, exactly. The tone and the agenda behind the question, perhaps.
Yeah. What are you up to? What are you up to, Stone? Come on, spill. There's a comment here from Gail Handley. I love the simplicity of this. Just ask all the scientists to sit with a medium and get a message from their departed loved one. Job done.
Job done.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. That is a possibility, I suppose. The problem is obviously, which medium,
Yeah. Yeah.
on which day,
Yeah. Yeah. Very true.
and of course, there'll always be, again, the thing is, that the scientists will want to put in controls in place for that, and although that's possible, a scientist won't ever take the first thing. They will try and explore, because there are other alternatives, other alternative explanations, and so forth. And so, what a good scientist would do is try and eliminate the possibilities to arrive, hopefully, at one concluding possibility that's the most likely explanation of what's going on. So you could sit with that medium. I mean, that's what I did, and it was enough to convince me. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. Mark's just coming back there. He'll keep an ear to the ground.
Fair enough.
Phil Shaw here, just saying the College of Psychic Studies still holds authentic and candid documentation from SPR dignitaries relating to research into the aforementioned mediums.
That's it. I think it's Leslie Price, isn't it? Who's the librarian, or that holds all that information, or manages all that information anyway. So yeah, absolutely. As I said, the College of Psychic Studies, with Arthur Conan Doyle, for example, and all these organisations, all formed not only to help people unfold their mediumship, but also to provide a rational sort of basis for mediumship and spiritualism. Because that was very important. You remember that was very important in the 1900s, so that spiritualism wasn't seen as a fringe. It was seen as something that had a very strong, rational, scientific basis behind it. And and as I said, what we're trying to do is encourage that sort of legacy into the 21st century.
Most definitely. I mean, if we turn the tables here slightly, the room is full of mediums tonight, so absolutely wonderful. Thank you all for being here. Could I turn this around and just say, as a working medium, and this is to everybody in the room, have you ever stood on the platform and proved conclusively in one message to one person the continuity of life? You may give the evidence. I'm a big one. We will give the evidence to support that thought, but I don't, speaking personally, I've never delivered that epiphany moment to somebody. There's been a short series of revelations where you bring through, but that person will then go out and go, well, I don't, and the responsibility that comes with it. So, and if we take that energy and turn that around to the scientific community working with us as mediums, then no, it's not going to be this big blast epiphany moment. It is just going to be a continual building of the facts, of the information, the evidence, the knowledge, the understanding that will take you to a conclusion. So now that's to everybody in the room.
Absolutely. No, I think you're absolutely right. And it is one of these little bugbears of mine when I hear mediums say the purpose of mediumship is to give proof of survival. No, the purpose of mediumship is to give evidence of survival. The proof lies with the recipient as to whether that's proof or not.
Yeah.
But there's also added complication to that, is that we have all been schooled from early childhood in believing that the physical world is the only world, and it's only the materialist world exists. And so very often, even if you do give good evidence, I find personally, give good evidence, and the medium and the recipient comes up to you after and say, "Oh, thank you very much. I can understand that was my father. That was whatever." Full well that by the time they've gone to bed that night, woken up in the morning, all those doubts, all that skepticism, all that schooling from the physical world and so forth has come in and has just basically diluted that passion or that feeling that they had, or that confidence in their own thinking they had at that time, and has just diluted that into, well, like you said, no, well, was it not?
Mm.
But of course, the other aspect of this, and psychologists would say, is that we have this what's called the Forer effect. And the Forer effect seems to suggest, or it's kind of like a bias that we do. And the Forer effect is such that what happens is we have a tendency of remembering the hits and forgetting the misses. And so what we do is we put added weight or added relevance on things that we think are hits, and we sort of like ignore the misses. So I've seen it quite time and time again in a church sitting, in the congregation watching another medium work, is that they may have had a really appalling demonstration, and we all have them every once in a while.
Yeah.
And that medium might just say one or two pieces of evidence, and the person will say yes, yes, yes. Me sitting in the background, I'm thinking to myself, well, that doesn't give any evidence of anything or prove anything really to the recipient. But they only think of those. They only hold on to those bits, ignoring everything else the medium has said, which they couldn't understand or couldn't accept. But just those 2 or 3 pieces was enough for them to be convinced. And it's like, well, really? Can you really be convinced by that? But that's an example of the Forer effect, where we add additional weighting or additional emphasis on things that we think are true, or we add, so as I said, we remember the hits, but seem to forget the misses.
Yeah, and
So
unfortunately, as working mediums, we ourselves tend to remember the misses and forget the hits.
Absolutely. And that might be because the studies have seemed to show, there's been some studies been looking at mental health, because one of the things back in the day that people used to say about mediums is that we're basically hysterical individuals. We've got some sort of psychopathology. We're basically mentally ill in some way. And there's been studies after study that have been done that's shown that actually mediums aren't, as we know, Ron, mediums aren't mentally ill at all, and actually what actually happens is that mediums, mediums, yeah.
I have a list.
We have exceptions, I'm sure, but mediums generally, as a group, as a body, generally enjoy a better level of mental health and well-being than non-mediums. So I often joke, and when I say to people, if someone comes up to you and you say you're a medium, and they say to you, "Oh, don't be daft, you're just mad," actually, the chances are it's the other way round, because it's a medium that enjoys the well-being. The only thing that the studies seem to suggest is that mediums have a higher incidence of being neurotic. Okay, being anxious and neurotic. Now, what's interesting is I often question this: is being neurotic and an anxious sort of personality type, has that led us to be a medium, or as our unfoldment as a medium in terms of our sensitivity, led us to be more heightened in our sensitivity and become more neurotic and anxious? We don't know which way the circle is formed. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
But the literature, and this is consistent in quite a few studies, seems to suggest mediums, not individually every single person, but as a whole, as a group, if you're compared with non-mediums, the general public, we have a tendency of being more anxious and have more sort of neurotic sort of personalities.
Yeah, I can go along with that, and I love that about which way does that circle go.
Exactly.
Yeah, is it because we are heightened perception that we are like that, or becoming like that has heightened our perception? Yeah,
exactly. So examples I was saying about the scientific method there. So what a researcher might do would take that piece of information and say, well, just as we've said, well, which way around does that circle go? And then may design an experiment to look at that. And that's the scientific method. You take one piece of information that's been published in a journal and you say, okay, well, they've done that, but what can we do to improve that body of knowledge in some way? Yeah. Anyway.
Roy McKay, lovely gent who has now moved down near the church. We love you, Roy. Yeah. We love a medium living next door. One wonders what the personal views and beliefs of the scientists are during these tests. We understand your perspective from the information given. Do you sit down with others and chew the fat?
Well, no, I mean, the thing is, if you go somewhere like, you go to a conference like the Society for Psychical Research, or you go to the Parapsychological Association conferences, or the conference of the Society for Scientific Exploration. These are all sorts of international conferences that explore alternatives, shall we say, and amongst that you will have, healing and mediumship, NDEs and consciousness and all sorts of things here. And there are a lot of scientists who have the belief that that there is something, how many scientists are willing to say that while they're still in their academic careers, because it's not always very career progressing to admit this, and hence why a lot of the scientists who come out do so once they've retired. But that means that aside, there are more and more younger scientists, younger researchers, as I said, who are doing PhDs in their early 20s. I'm quite old now, in my 40s, coming up to 50, doing a PhD, but there are those in their 20s who are doing PhDs who are, open to the belief in communication with the spirit world, and who are genuinely interested, and as I mentioned, I think earlier, is that there are universities now, and the fact that we have universities now who are willing to sponsor or willing to supervise students looking at survival or mediumship, and willing to give people doctorates in that field, shows how tide has shifted and how there is more openness to this concepts or these beliefs of this. But something that's mentioned in that question is the beliefs of scientists during these tests. Now, I mentioned about the Forer effect, which is one of the biases that we experience, but there's another bias, and that's called the experimenter bias. It's been published in literature time and time again that it depends on, sometimes there seems to be a correlation between the expectancy and the beliefs of the experimenter and the results of the experiment. There was a famous study that was published several years ago between two researchers. One was very open to the possibility of, I think they were looking at healing, in particular spiritual healing or some healing capacity or healing art. And one was very supportive and one was very negative towards it, or very skeptical towards it. They both looked at the data from this experiment and both interacted with the participants. But what was really interesting was, whereas one saw the information and illustrated it in a positive light, the one that was skeptical produced the information, the same data, but framed it in a very negative way, to disprove. And what I have to say is, it wasn't a conscious thing between the two. Okay, it wasn't that I'm skeptical and so therefore I'm going to prove it right, and to hell what the evidence says, to the hell of that. It was very much an unconscious bias. Okay, so it's what we call the experimenter effect, and the fact that the experimenter can influence the results of the studies. So it is kind of important to know what the personal beliefs or views of the experimenter are, because that can have an impact on the results of the experiment.
Wonderful. Back to Denmark. As traditional science is very much about measuring weight, etc., gives a limited opportunity to bring evidence of spirit. Are you aware of new ways or techniques in modern science that can bring a broader variety of measurements?
Okay. Again, we go back to what I was saying about the fact that we're moving away from looking at measuring evidence, because and moving into what we call process focused. What we can do with that is, one of the areas that I've looked at time and time again is what we call the neurophysiological aspects of mediumship. And what I mean by that is, can we measure changes in the body that relate to mediumship in some way? And so one area that I looked at was looking at EEG, looking at the brain activity in the brain, and in particular with trance mediums. And we found, and this was I presented this at one of the SBR conferences several years ago, the data from this, and we could see screen captures from the or see measures from the trance mediums that seem to share similar type of activity, and so that's different from other forms of activity. Okay, and let me give you an example of what I mean here. One of the things we often get told about, if I just quickly present this, and it just gets, we often get told, don't we, that as mediums, that everything's in our imagination. You're not really communicating with the spirit world. It's really our imagination doing it. You're just making it up. And what's interesting is that scientists have actually picked up on this and said, well, okay, well, if it's their imagination, let's have a look at that. And what they've got here, there's a paper that was done. When was this done? Where's the date on here? I can't see it at the moment. Oh, 2013. Actually, so it's quite an old paper, 2013, that looked at electrical cortical activity. So looking at the brain activity with mediums. And what they found was that what they did was they got these mediums, and very similar to, I think, Lawrence, that you was explaining to me earlier before this meeting, was that they got the mediums to imagine certain things.
Yeah.
Okay, and measured the activity. So they got them to think of certain things, then use their imagination to do creative thinking, and then connect with the spirit world. And what they found was that the brain activity was very different in those three things. And so they were able to conclude that when someone is using their mediumship, they're not actually thinking in that capacity of not cognitively thinking, perceptual load thinking, but also they weren't actually using their imagination either. So as this paper says here, the differences suggest the impressions of communication with the deceased may be a distinct mental state, distinct from ordinary thinking or imagination. And so, these are ways in which scientists and researchers are using technology, not necessarily to prove the evidence, but to demonstrate that mediums are doing something distinct from common sort of everyday things, such as imagining certain things or making things up. One of the things that skeptics were saying, you're just making things up. Well, this sort of research here seems to suggest the contrary. We're not making things up. We're not using our creative imagination. There is other faculties going on in our brain that's actually giving us the answers.
Wonderful. Colin Walker, do you think the issue is duality, the separateness between science and spirit?
Do you think science is duality, separation? I wouldn't say science and spirit. I would say the physical and the non-physical. What we have to understand is that if we go back the history of science, we go back to the scientific revolution or the Enlightenment period, as it was called. Prior to the Enlightenment period, there was no such thing as the physical world and the material world. It was all seen as one, as I understand it. And it was only when you had the likes of René Descartes, Isaac Newton, and so forth, who realized that they could explain the physical world using maths, that they decided, well, actually, we can explain the physical world using maths, but hey, we can't do anything about the immaterial world. So guess what? We're just going to shut that out and pretend that doesn't exist. And that's where the scientific stance has been ever since. If we're able to prove it mathematically, it must exist. If we can't prove it mathematically, it doesn't exist. Well, of course, there could be a lot of flaws with that, because there are always opportunities to discover something new. So is there an issue with duality? Yes, there is. It's because there is a duality when actually there shouldn't be one.
Brilliant.
Okay.
Absolutely, Chris. Chris,
Okay.
what a wonderful evening.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure to be here.
Absolutely yeah, so much in there to make you think. So much in there to make you think. Thank you again for giving up your time tonight. There's so much appreciated. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Wherever you are, I know we've gone across the world tonight. And yeah, absolutely. Chris.
Great. Thank you very much for having me.
Brilliant.
It's been a pleasure.
Don't forget, everybody, we will be streaming our service live tomorrow morning from the church here in Poole. And tomorrow we have a medium whose face I can see, and he is a CSNU certificate holder. And he is an absolute lovely gentleman. And he took our healing course here. And the more I'm digging, the further away I'm getting from his name. Somebody remind me. So yes, we have a wonderful service. Oh my God, how embarrassing. Do you know what? I do this sometimes on the platform. I turn to introduce a medium and look at them and think, yep, you've got a name.
You've got a name.
Oh,
it's called Tip of the Tongue, and it was something that my researchers found is quite common in mediums as well.
Yes. Thank you. At last, an excuse. David Powell. There you go. Please don't be watching tonight, David. Thank you, Sue. Thank you, Mark. David Powell is our medium tomorrow. God, we're going to live that one down. Don't anybody tell him. Yes, all right, everybody. Stop it now. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Don't forget, you can re-watch this at a later date. I will put this out if it's all right with you, Chris.
Absolutely,
Podcast as well. Because I find the podcast, actually, I take a lot more in when I'm listening rather than thinking I've got to find an hour to watch something. I can just have it on and go, oh, yeah, that's quite interesting. Yeah. So we'll be releasing that later this weekend. Thank you all for joining us. Chris, thank you for coming along, talking to us. It's so nice. We have swapped thoughts and ideas in a few groups online, but it's actually really nice to meet the person. Thank you. Anyway, everybody, have a wonderful night while you're all busy laughing at me because I'm a medium, so I'm allowed to forget. Oh, God, I'm so going to milk that. Have a wonderful evening, everybody. Take care. God bless. Good night.